In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Father, we thank you for this holy season of Lent. As we reflect on the thousands of years of fellow Christians' path through history, and as we explore those ancient roots, may we hear the Holy Spirit guiding us to appreciate our past and look forward to our ultimate goal of eternal life with you. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Tonight, we're for a treat as our own pastor, Father Joseph Shea, presents part one of 2 parts, Myths about the Catholic Church. Father Joe was ordained in 1978, and before coming here about 6.5 years ago, he served as associate pastor at St. Ignatius in Los Angeles, St. John Vianney in Hacienda Heights, as well as pastor of Holy Family Parish in Glendale for 13 years. Also on his resume is 6 years as director of vocations for the Archdiocese. The university tries to stick to a schedule of 7:30 till 9, and sometimes we run a little over. We understand if you need to leave at 9. And if there's going to be time for questions and answers after Father's presentation. So please join me in welcoming Father Joseph Shea.
Good evening. It's a delight to be with you. Last year I started this whole series responding to the 20 top myths, old and new, about the Catholic Church. And I did it because, some of these myths are just accepted hands down by the world around us. And we often just kind of get sucked into it. Well, I guess that's right. And I want to kind of highlight some of these myths. And so last year I began it and I did 3 of the myths. I did the first one, religion, in particular Catholicism, is the #1 cause of violence and war in the history of the world. Number 2, the Catholic Church has declared a war on women, is anti-woman and misogynistic. We've heard those just very much recently, in the political debates. Number 3, the Crusades were medieval crimes against humanity, a prime example of destructive religious zealotry. By the way, next week, if you come next week, I'll have a copy of those first 3 here for you so you can take it. And then at the end of this, you can get copies of this session. Tonight, I'd like to be, in the second session, I'd like to talk about 2 more myths. I cut it down because it was a little bit too much, 3 in one night. So we're going to do 2 tonight, 2 next Monday. First myth we're going to talk about is myth number 4. Catholicism, specifically, and Christianity generally, is derived from paganism, just recycled, rehashed pagan myths. And the 5th myth will be that the Middle Ages was just one long, dark age of ignorance and superstition, relieved only by the advent of the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, rationalism, and modernism. So let's get started with the first one. The Catholicism is just rehashed paganism. Not many people in our modern society really know secular history, and even fewer have a knowledge of and appreciation of Catholic history. So they become easy prey for purveyors of fanciful histories and myths, particularly the claim that Catholicism, in specific, Christianity in general, is derived from paganism. It's just recycled pagan myths. Anti-Catholic critics, including many modern secularists, they often suggest that the Catholic Church did get the truth in the beginning, but when the Edict of Milan happened, when Constantine issued that in 313, allowing Christianity to be legal, then everything began to change. Because once the church opened the doors, then all these pagan influences started to come into the church, and it began to corrupt the church. Drawing from the title of Martin Luther's book, it was called The Great Babylonian Captivity. And as they said, okay, the church had the truth, but with the Edict of Milan, it lost the truth. It was influenced by paganism. And the truth was only rediscovered by the Protestant reformers. Now, the problem with this theory is that one needs to prove that the Catholic Church taught something different before the Edict of Milan than what was taught afterwards. And there is no such proof. In fact, the opposite is true. We have a consistent history of documented history that the Church has taught the same thing all the way through, even to this present day. But the opponents of the Catholic Church, both secular and some Christian denominations, they try to prove this theory by attempting to show similarities between Catholicism, its beliefs and practices, and beliefs and practices of ancient pagan cultures and religions. This fallacy is often committed by certain Christian fundamentalists against Roman Catholics, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Mormons. We're thrown in with those because fundamentalist Christians believe that we are also a cult, as they call those groups a cult. Other fundamental Christians commit this fallacy against not only Roman Catholics, but also mainstream Protestants. And atheists and skeptics, they often commit this fallacy, promote this myth against both Christians and Jewish people. Where did it all come from? Well, the 19th century witnessed a real flowering of this, what I call pagan influence myth or fallacy. It was that era which saw some publications of books. For example, The Two Babylons by Alexander Hyssop. That book is the classic English text that charges that the Catholic Church derived itself from paganism. And it paved the way, that book paved the way for generations of antagonism against the Church. Also during that very same time, if you know history, in the 1800s, new sects developed, such as Seventh-day Adventists, Mormons, and Jehovah's Witnesses. And all these consider traditional Catholicism and mainstream Protestantism as polluted by paganism. They have the truth, they don't. Also, that era saw the rise of atheistic free thinkers like Robert Ingersoll. He began writing books attacking the Catholic faith and Judaism, claiming that they were pagan. This pagan influence myth has not gone away in the 20th century, but thanks be to God, new archaeological finds and discoveries and more mature scholarship, it's diminished its influence. Yet, there's a whole lot of people out there propagating this myth, both even family members, friends, often in the media. For example, in Protestant circles, numerous works have continued to popularize the claims of Alexander Hyssop, most notably things like Lorraine Bettner's Roman Catholicism. If you didn't know it, Lorraine Bettner's Roman Catholicism is the Bible, the source book of all anti-Catholic claims. When I first arrived here, someone came up to me and gave me this list of questions. He said, "Father, this was on the website of Cornerstone Church, a letter written to all my Catholic brothers and sisters asking these following questions or making these charges. What do you think about that?" And I said, what I think is you go right to the book, Lorraine Bettner's Roman Catholicism, and it's right there. He took that right from the book. And the problem is that with that book, it makes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of claims, but gives zero footnotes. You can make any claim in the world you want, but you don't back it up with any footnotes, historical footnotes. Very few people know whether it's true or not. Things like the comic books of Jack Chick. Anybody remember those at all? Boy, I remember when I was a newly ordained priest, constantly on Sunday Mass, I'd go out there and all these little comic books had been put on the window shields of all the cars in our parking lot. They had someone going out. Jack Chick is up in kind of in the Santa Clarita area, just north of the San Fernando Valley. There's a center there, and they're cartoon comic books that make all these claims. Another book would be written by Ralph Woodrow called The Babylon Mystery Religions. again, regurgitating the same claims that Alexander Hyssop had made. Now, I should say this, that later on, Ralph Woodrow, he realized his flaws, and he wrote a second book called The Babylon Connection. And in this second book, he repudiated what he said in the first book. And he absolutely refuted Alexander Hyssop's claims. But as you well know, once a book is out, the first book is often quoted, not the second. Other Christian and quasi-Christian sects have continued to charge mainstream Christianity with paganism, and many atheists have continued to repeat those same claims, literally unquestioned. That's why I'm teaching this course. People kind of hear this stuff and they go, well, I guess it's true. No, it's not true, but you need some information. Huh? These charges have been made and repeated for a couple centuries now. For example, Alexander Hyslop and Jack Chick, they argue that the hosts that we use in Catholic communion are round, just like the wafer hosts of the sun worshipers of Baal. Well, what they both don't bother to mention is that the wafers used by the pagans were also ovals, triangles, some with edges folded over, others shaped like animals or leaves. But it's just the fact that something is oval does not make it immoral, wrong, or pagan. Since even the Jews, they had circular wafers and cakes, excuse me, that they offered in the Old Testament. So those arguments presented by these more modern critics, Jack Chick and Hyslop and stuff, they just fall flat and they actually backfire against them. Often, if you go to their books like this, you open them up and they have illustrations, and you'll see drawings of ancient priests with headdresses on that appear on one. Some of them are like little beehive headdresses, and others are kind of pointed like this. So they'll picture that picture there, and then they'll show a picture of the Pope wearing a tiara. Remember the Pope used to wear a triple crown? It was called a tiara to represent the three faculties of the Pope: to teach, to rule, to sanctify. Well, they don't wear it anymore because it's pretty pompous, but you can see them in the Vatican Museum. Or the bishops, they wear the mitre. And so they'll juxtapose these pictures and say, see, look at this, did it? The Pope wears something like that. The bishop, these priests did it. The bishops wear it. They must be pagan. Some atheists will take the pagan connection even one step further, saying that Christianity is just a regurgitation of pagan myths. And they go citing many things from pagan religions. Things like that the Christians believe in the incarnation, the dogma of the incarnation, that the Son of God became man, was born of the Virgin Mary. The Christian belief of a divinity born of a virgin, a venerated mother and child, they say is just like Isis and Osiris of the Egyptians, or Isa and Iswara, or Fortuna and Jupiter, and Semiramis and Tammuz in the pagan religions and cultures. Some pagan religions had a triune God, and these gods were often pictured with wings, just as God is verbally pictured in the Psalm 91, verse 4, with wings. The flames on the head of the apostles were also seen as an omen of the gods in Roman poetry and in heathen myths long before Pentecost ever happened to the Christian church. So because it was there, here it is again. A rock struck by Moses, Numbers 20, verse 11. Remember, he struck the rock and water came out? Well, it's just what the goddess Rhea did long before Moses. Also, Jesus, identified by a Christian icon or iconography. One of them is the fish. You have ever seen that on the back of cars, the fish? Where does that come from? Well, the Greek word for fish is ichthus, and it was used as an acronym for the early Christian church. Each letter of the word ichthus stands for word, and the 5 letters stand for Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. But because it's the word fish, and then you had the symbol of it, they say, see, that's just like the fish god Dagon. Also, atheists will quote Mircea Eliade, who wrote a wonderful book called The History of Religion, saying that many of the themes present in Christianity, well, those themes and myths were part of, myths and rituals of the ancient pagan world. And Mircea Eliade lists a lot of them. A God descended to take incarnate form. A God became man. A God battled with powers of darkness. A God descended into the underworld to redeem the dead. A God is brought back to life in the springtime of the year. A king is sacrificed to atone for the sins of the people. A God ascends back into heaven. An innocent warrior is sacrificed. A scapegoated victim. See, when these atheists see these parallels or these somewhat similarities, what they end up saying, well, you see, Christianity is merely paganism warmed up. All those ancient myths are simply just swept up, rehashed, mashed together with added spices and forced into Christianity, kind of like making a sausage. And just as we no longer believe in Ishtar and Moloch or Odin and Zeus, well, we no longer need to believe in that other mythical hero, Jesus Christ. Now, here's the problem. The problem is that these claims by fundamentalist Christians, as well as certain sects and by atheists, the fact of the matter is these claims are shot through and through with all kinds of fallacies of logic and historical inaccuracies. Now, fortunately, like the attacks on Catholicism in particular, all of the supposed parallels or similarities mentioned, that I just mentioned, they really self-destruct when examined with some kind of scholarly rigor. And that's what we must do, is have this kind of rigor to know things so we can challenge it. If these claims are not guilty of historical inaccuracies, all of them are certainly guilty of what we can call the pagan influence fallacy. What do I mean by that? What I mean by this is that anything can be attacked using the pagan influence fallacy or its derivative. In other words, something we do today, you could find that experience in the past. For example, that you use in rings, you exchange rings when you get married. That's been used in many cultures of the past. So, you see? Catholics are pagan because or you dress in a white dress. How many women here got married in a white dress here? Well, you're pagan. Because a pagan did that. See, it doesn't necessarily, the connection just because it happened doesn't mean it is. The pagan influence fallacy is committed when one charges that a particular religion or a particular belief or practice is of pagan origin or has been influenced by paganism, and therefore it's false, wrong, tainted, and it has to be repudiated. Just because a pagan did something doesn't make it false. The pagans used to give a ring as a reminder of the love that was committed one to the other, the sign of an eternal love. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, that happens to coincide with our own belief as Christians, but there's nothing wrong with that, you see. Now, in its minimal form, the pagan influence fallacy is really a subcase of what we call the genetic fallacy. A genetic fallacy improperly judges a thing based on its history of origin rather than on its merits. I'll give you an example of that. No one should use this particular medicine like penicillin because it was invented by a drunkard or an adulterer. Well, it doesn't matter what was invented. Is it good in itself? Of course. So it's not discounted. But you use these claims, you have to then just discount that. Now, very frequently, the pagan influence fallacy is committed in connection with other fallacies of logic. You know, that was one of the courses we took in the seminary. And I'm really glad, because logic teaches you to think reasonably, orderly, And one of the pagan influence fallacies, or one of the fallacies of logic that the pagan influence fallacy commits is what we call post hoc ergo propter hoc, or propter hoc. Post hoc, after this, therefore because of it. Does that make sense? Because of after the event, therefore it's because of the event. Well, there's a lot of fallacy with that. Post hoc, ergo propter hoc. Some ancient pagans did or believed something millennia ago. Therefore, any similar Christian practice and belief, if it's like it, well, obviously that must be derived from the source. That's a fallacy of logic, you see. Now, a variation of that fallacy is often committed in which as soon as a similarity or parallel with something pagan is noted, it's assumed also that the pagan counterpart is the more ancient one. A variation of that could be called the similis hoc ergo propter hoc. Similar to these are Latin phrases. Similar to this, therefore because of this. Again, I'll give you that example. The picture that you see sometimes in these fundamentalist books showing a priest of a pagan religion wearing a beehive kind of headdress, and then showing a pope wearing, in the old pictures, like old times, the tiara, the triple tiara. Like it, therefore it is it. That's a fallacy. Now, when the pagan influence fallacy is met, what you need to do is point out, that's a fallacy. It's not right thinking. Now, to help to clarify that to a religious person, let's say it's a fundamentalist challenging with it, when a fundamentalist commits this pagan influence, it might be helpful to illustrate with cases where the pagan influence fallacy could even be committed against his own position. For example, the practice of circumcision was practiced in the ancient world by a number of ancient people, including the Egyptians. But you know, there are few Jewish people or Christians who would say that its divinely authorized use in Israel was an example of pagan corruption. Or, how about this? Showing an ancient pagan priest holding a book and then showing an additional picture right next to it, juxtaposing them, showing a Christian minister holding a Bible, say, hey, they look similar, therefore they are the same. So the Bible came from a pagan origin. See, that's how it turns back on them if you don't think it through logically. To help a secular, like an atheist, to see the fallacy involved, you can point to a parallel case of the genetic fallacy involving his own belief and perspective. For example, when they say that, post hoc, ergo, propter hoc, or looks like it, therefore it is the same, you say, well, you know, how about this? Someone shouldn't accept this particular scientific fact or theory because it was developed by an atheist. It falls apart. So whenever you encounter a proposed example of pagan influence, number one thing you must do is demand that its existence be properly documented, not just asserted. See, the danger of accepting an inaccurate claim, it's too great. You know, it's just too great. There's a lot of misinformation, and it's advisable that if you hear something like this, ask for the documentation from a primary source, not just, well, I read it somewhere. No, show me the documentation. I'll tell you where I really learned my lesson in this. Once I gave a whole sermon, a beautiful thing. It was kind of, I think, on the Transfiguration. But I read a story on the internet about this guy, and it turned out he said it was Mel Gibson. He had a very terrible accident, and then this gracious man provided things, and he had plastic surgery, and he came out looking like he did. Well, I based my whole sermon on that, and then all of a sudden someone showed me that it was all make-believe. I should have gone to Snopes, checked it out. You know, just because it's on the internet doesn't make it true. You need to check things out before you use something, because there's a lot of information out there. And then after receiving the documentation supposedly supporting a claim of a pagan similarity between our beliefs and something in the past in a pagan culture, you should also ask a number of questions. Number one, is there a parallel? Is there a similarity? You know, frequently there is not. You know, they make a claim, but there is no similarity. The claim of being a parallel or similarity may be very erroneous, especially when the documentation provided is really something old or undisclosed. As I mentioned, Lorraine Bettner writes a whole book and maybe has 4 footnotes for the hundreds of claims he makes, maybe 4. And even those I don't think are accurate. Robert Ingersoll, the famous atheist of the 19th century who wrote the book Why I Am an Agnostic, he stated, the Egyptians had a trinity. They worshipped Osiris, Isis, and Horus thousands of years before the Christians believed and worshiped the triune God, the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's written there, but brothers and sisters, that ain't true. The Egyptians had an Ennead, a pantheon of 9 major gods and goddesses. Osiris, Isis, and Horus were simply 3 divinities in that pantheon who were closely related by marriage and blood, and they also figured in the same myth cycle. But they didn't represent the 3 persons, one in God, the teaching of the Trinity. So the claim of an Egyptian Trinity, it's just simply wrong. There is no parallel, there is no similarity. The second question you should ask, is the parallel dependent or independent? See, even if there is a pagan similarity, that doesn't mean that there is a connection between them, a cause between that one caused the other. For example, 2 groups may develop similar beliefs and practices and artifacts totally independent of each other. The idea that similar forms are always the result of the diffusion from one common source, that has been long rejected by archaeology and anthropology, and for very good reasons. You see, humans are similar and live in similar kinds of environments, leading them to have similar kinds of artifacts and tools and beliefs and views. For example, if you read a lot of fundamentalists, I used to do a study on fundamentalist Christianity so I could respond, because I used to get all these questions thrown at me. But fundamentalists had made a huge uproar about the fact that Catholic art includes the Madonna and Child, Mary and the baby Jesus. And look, non-Catholic pagan art all over the world also includes mother and child images. Well, there's nothing sinister in that, brothers and sisters, and I'll tell you why. The fact is, in every culture, there are mothers who hold children. Just look at it. Go to the National Geographic. You don't have to go around the world. Just see it there. They hold children. And sometimes this gets represented in art, including religious art, and it especially is used when the work of art is being done to show, for example, the motherhood of some individual. So mother and child images do not need to be explained by a theory of diffusion that it came from a common pagan religious source, as Alexander Hislop suggests when he says in his book that it's just like the representations in art of Semiramis holding Tammuz, the child. See, one needs to look no further than the fact that mothers holding children is a universal feature of human experience, and it's a convenient way for artists to represent motherhood. So, is the parallel dependent or independent? It's important to ask that. Number 3, is the parallel antecedent or consequent? Is it before it or after it? See, even if the pagan parallel is causally related to a non-pagan counterpart, this doesn't establish what gave rise to the other. It may be that the pagan parallel is a late borrowing from the non-pagan or the Christian source. Pagan sources are so late that they often have been shaped in response to the Jewish and the Christian religions. That happens all the time. For example, in the Bible, the list of the Bibles, the books in the Old Testament, we Catholics believe there's 46 books in the Old Testament. Christians and Jewish people have 39 in the Old Testament. And the reason is we took the list of books from the ancient list called the Alexandrian list, and they, in reaction to the Christians, the Jewish people after the Israel and Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed, they set up a criterion. They set up what really makes up the Old Testament. The Christians took the Septuagint, which had been used for 300 or 400 years before Christ, or 200 years before Christ. They took it and they used it. It was only after the fact that the Jewish people set up their list. So it was in response to the Christian church that the Jewish list, or the Hebrew canon, came out. So is it before or after? Sometimes it's possible to tell that pagans have been borrowing from non-pagans, like Christians. Other times it can't be discerned who's borrowing from whom, or if anyone is borrowing from anyone else. For example, H.A. Gruder, in his book, The Norseman, he states that the ideas expressed in the Norse Elder Edda about the end and the regeneration of the world were probably influenced by the teachings of Christians with whom the Norsemen were in contact for many ways, because it was a later publication. But if you didn't know history, you'd say, oh, there it is again. Christians are borrowing from the pagans. There it is. No, you've got to know whether it's before or after, and is there a connection between them? Number 4 question, is the parallel, the similarity, treated positively, neutrally, or negatively? See, even if there is a pagan similarity to us, that doesn't mean that the item or the concept was enthusiastically or uncritically accepted by us. Because something happened over there, doesn't mean we accept it. See, we have to ask, how did they regard it? Did they regard it as something positive or neutral or negative? Let me give you an example of that again. Circumcision might be termed a neutral Jewish counterpart to a pagan parallel. See, it's quite likely that the early Hebrews first encountered the idea of circumcision among neighboring non-Jewish people. But that doesn't mean they regarded it as a religiously good thing for non-Jews to do. Circumcision was regarded as a religiously good thing only for Jews, because for them it symbolized what? The special covenant that God established with his people. We see that in Genesis 17. The Hebrew scriptures are silent in the religious appraisal of non-Jewish circumcision. They seemed indifferent to the fact that some pagan people around them circumcised their children. Oh, how about for us in the Christian faith? The symbol of the cross. It might be termed or seen as a neutral Christian counterpart to a pagan similarity. The early Christians who adopted the cross as a symbol, they didn't do so because it was a pagan symbol. See, the pagans used that symbol, notably in East Asia, also in the Americas, but they had no influence on the Christian outlook or belief. The cross was used as a Christian symbol because why? Jesus died on the cross. His execution, which was regarded as a very bad thing, the worst thing that ever happened to the world, the total, most infinite injustice, but it was one which brought about eternal life for the world. So Christians didn't adopt it because the pagans' world had it. Adopted it because they believed this was the very essence of our faith. An example of a negative parallel or similarity can be found in the Genesis account of the flood. The flood narrative in Genesis 6 to 9, chapter 6 to 9, it does have parallels to pagan flood stories. And you often hear this said. I've heard it many times. Oh, it was there and they just stole it from them and just kind of made a little changes here and there. No. Because why? Because the divine revelation in Genesis refutes many of the ideas in the other one. The Genesis story of the flood attributes the flood to what? Human sin, not to overpopulation as Athraios in the epic and the Greek poem Cypria did. The presence of flood stories in cultures around the world, it doesn't undermine, discount, or paganize the biblical narrative. In fact, it adds credence to it. Another area where we can see this criticism, refutation, and replacement are also the principles behind modern holidays being celebrated to a limited extent around the same time as former pagan holidays. You hear this all the time, you know. I hear that, in fact, every time we come to Christmas, you hear this pagan fallacy. Oh, what the Christians did is they simply took the feast of Saturnalia and they simply Christianized it, you know. It's the same thing. No, there's a lot of difference to it, I'm sorry. In actuality, the reports of Christmas, it doesn't occur on Saturnalia. However, to the extent that the phenomenon occurs at all, Christian holidays were introduced to provide what? A wholesome, non-pagan, alternative celebration, which critiques and often rejects that Christian pagan holiday. You know, the pagans used to believe that the sun god rose, you know, at Christmas, right at the winter solstice when the sun is lowest in the sky. And the pagans used to believe, oh my gosh, if we don't worship and do wild rituals and coax that sun back up, we're going to die because the sun brings life. And the Christian ministry said, that's not a God. The true God is Jesus Christ. He was the light of the world. He was born into our world to dispel the darkness. And he came to give us life. You're worshiping the wrong God. They refuted it, huh? In order to evangelize non-believers or pagans, Christian missionaries would often appropriate things familiar to the pagans or to the non-Christian world, and in a sense, they baptized them, giving a whole new Christian meaning. You see that a lot when they take pagan springs or wells and they change the name of it. They give it a whole new teaching. By the way, you know, fundamentalists often criticize the Catholic Church with paganism by using these examples. But you can turn it right back on and say, well, if they're offended by that, then guess what? They need to be offended by, for example, Halloween. They're always offended by Halloween. That's a pagan thing. They stole it right from paganism. Halloween actually means the Eve of All Hallows, the eve of the feast of all saints. And it was put on top of it to counteract what the pagans believed, that these evil spirits would wander around at that night, and so you put on masks to confuse the spirits so you wouldn't be attacked by them. The church put an Eve of All Hallows, Halloween, to counteract that. But the fundamentalists have done the same thing. They have, in place of Halloween, what do? They put an alternative thing called Reformation Day, which they celebrate with their children. The modern Protestant holiday of Reformation Day, it was based on the fact that the Reformation began when Martin Luther put on the Church of Wittenberg 95 Thesis. What day did he do it on? October 31st, huh? 1517. And so they have a feast of Reformation Day. But I say, hey, you did the very same thing. You took a feast that was pagan and you made it Christian. But now if you use your reasoning, you're guilty. You've fallen into the paganism. We don't believe that, but you could turn back on them. Another fundamentalist substitute for Halloween has been these harvest festivals that celebrate the season of autumn and the gatherings of the cross. The fact is, the fundamentalist Christian substitutions, what was pagan with their own kinds of holidays, as the Christian church has done, they're no more pagan than the celebrations of days or seasons that may have been introduced by earlier Christians. No. So ultimately, all attempts to prove that Christianity in general, Catholicism specifically, is derived from paganism, it just falls flat in its face. Catholic doctrines are neither borrowed from the mystery religions nor introduced from pagans after the conversion of Constantine and the passing of the Edict of Milan. See, to make that charge of paganism stick, one must have to be able to show more than a similarity between something in the church and something in the non-Christian world. And one must be able to demonstrate a legitimate connection between the two, showing clearly that one is a result of the other and there's something wrong with the non-Christian item. See, it's not just say that there's something that looks like it, appears like it, or maybe was borrowed from it, but was it wrong? You know, the presumption is the pagans didn't have any truth. That's not true. They had reason. They could reason to things. Certain things were true. Wedding rings, white clothes for weddings. There's nothing wrong with that. So in the final analysis, nobody has been able to prove that these things regard the things of the myth or the claims of the myth regarding doctrines of the church, beliefs or practices in the Catholic faith, that they are myths, that they're drawn from paganism. So the charge of paganism, brothers and sisters, it just doesn't work. It's just that, a lie and a myth. Let's go to the second one. Myth number 5. The Middle Ages were one long, dark age of ignorance and superstition, relieved only by the advent of the Great Renaissance and later by the succeeding movements of the Enlightenment, rationalism, and modernism. Brothers and sisters, there is little in our modern life that is more muddle-headed than the view that that most people have of the Middle Ages. But over and over again, you see this mentality on display in every corner of life. For example, 15 years ago, a professor from a prestigious university here in California was on video. It was one of a series of films made for remote learning to other colleges. It was also shown on TV. It was on the Middle Ages. The lectures were illustrated, and for the medieval section, most of the pictures were very dark and grotesque to reinforce the idea that the Middle Ages were the Dark Ages. Remember that? We used to say that? The Middle Ages? They were the Dark Ages. And the professor even made the comment that in the Middle Ages, when the sun went down, it got dark outside. And he then showed a picture of a very dark village on the screen. Well, guess what? For a long period of time, when it got dark outside, everything was dark, huh? And then when he got to the medieval people, he repeatedly referred to them as the awkwardness of their minds. They were so awkward that they built buildings that fell down. And on the building, you saw a picture of a building that was dilapidated, but actually the building that was falling down was from a totally different period than the Middle Ages. It was crumbling down. Well, a lot of buildings crumble. You see that all the time. In passing, the professor happened to mention that that period of the Middle Ages had produced the Gothic cathedrals, and that their foundations literally went down to the depth of a subway station, and the spires rose hundreds of feet in the air. But then he asked on the film, how, if their minds were so awkward, could medieval people produce such beauty? You know what his answer was? To compensate for their awkwardness of their minds. And then he goes on to say that we must not forget that these very awkward, ignorant people rarely knew what time it was, since the sundials could not work in the Dark Ages. Apparently, this professor had never heard of water clocks that were well in use during the Middle Ages. And needless to say, he made absolutely no mention of people like St. Thomas Aquinas, Roger Bacon, St. Bonaventure, Duns Scotus, or any other reasonably bright medieval thinker. This anti-medieval prejudice, it's built into our culture, especially by the uninformed or sometimes the prejudiced media, and especially from our equally uninformed school system. I don't want to say it's true for everybody, but generically, a lot of times you see that. I was talking to my sister, and she was listening. She's in a quilt making group, and at a table over, she was hearing these people regurgitate these wild claims that Western civilization destroyed the beautiful culture here in the United States and the Americas, deliberately bringing over these diseases so they could destroy the people. My sister listened to this for a while, and she's a very bright young lady. She walked over and says, "Excuse me, I just overheard this, and I have to tell you that is absolutely ridiculous." No one knew at the time when the Columbus and the succeeding explorers came over. No one knew about bacteriology and germs. They didn't know about it. Unwittingly, they did bring things like smallpox that did hurt the people, but they didn't do it deliberately. They just didn't know. If you want to make that claim, then how about going back to the 13th century when the Black Plague, the bubonic plague, are you going to go and say and blame China because the disease began in China and it came over with the rats and the ship and they got out into Europe and it spread? We don't say those people did it deliberately. No, it's just a fact. But that kind of stuff, the person was saying it happened to be a teacher in a high school, and I worry about what are they saying to these young people who will hear some of it and then just start kind of moving along with it. So it's not only in our school system, it's also in our media. You know, not long ago, I heard a reporter covering a civil war in another country, and he informed all of us listeners that the participants exhibited medieval barbarism. Often you hear sometimes a discussion of bizarre cult, which will include references to medieval superstitions. The phrase medieval torture is often used to describe really bad atrocities. I've heard this many times. Often, even you'll see in commercials, you know, companies are trying to sell a new product, whether it's a car, a computer, or endless other things. And that new product is often contrasted with the images of dark monastery halls with line of cowled monks carrying guttering candles. In the background, you hear Gregorian chant. What's the implication is the people of the Middle Ages were old and ignorant, anachronistic, out of touch. But this new thing is with it, huh? Get it? As I mentioned, teachers in our public school, they continue a lot of this myth. Where did the view come from? And is it true? After all, if there's smoke, people say, well, there must be a fire somewhere, somehow. Where did it come from? In a nutshell, here's where it came from. From the Renaissance authors, from Enlightenment philosophers, popular writers, and anyone who dislikes on principle any period strongly influenced by Christianity. All those people contributed to this myth about the Middle Ages. In more recent times, historians of the Renaissance have probably been than the most persistently scholarly promoters of the lie. Why is that? Well, if you love a certain period of life and you make that your life study, you're enamored with that historical period. That's your favorite period. And they're fond of showing how wonderful it is by contrasting it with the bad old days back then. This view and approach did not, of course, originate in the 20th century. It actually originated in the 14th century, when the first Italian humanists, the original Renaissance men, they began to idealize their particular time, the classical, and their particular time in the Renaissance, and the classical culture of ancient Greece and Rome. And so in order to exalt their culture and that past culture, to magnify the significance of their own literary works and accomplishments, what did they do? They deprecated the culture of the more recent past as deplorably backward and totally insufficiently concerned with the real world. And from there on, the Middle Ages became literally a historical football for many people of many persuasions to kick around. Many writers since have disparaged the medieval period out of sheer ignorance or due to a naive and sole reliance on the opinions of those original Renaissance writers or current Renaissance scholars who haven't really done their homework on any other age. Now, it should be noted that the first humanists, they were Catholic. First people of the Renaissance were Catholic. By the way, the church was promoter of many of the things in the Renaissance. Although some were critical of the church and others were interested in introducing heterodoxical religious ideas, in most cases, their disparaging of the Middle Ages did not spring from some hatred or animus towards Catholicism, but from a desire to exalt their own particular time with its new artistic and literary styles and with their new optimistic view of the world and humanity. For example, the 14th century writer Giovanni Boccaccio, he thought that poetry had been dead until it was brought to life by Dante in the new age of rebirth, which the Renaissance in Italian means. Well, the truth is, brothers and sisters, Dante was really a man of the Middle Ages, both of mentality and in faith. He had been born in the mid-13th century, which was certainly one of the greatest medieval centuries, because medievalism, we'll see at the video, goes from 500 up to the end of the 1300s, actually into the 1400s. Nonetheless, Renaissance writers extolled both Dante and Giotto, Dante's contemporary, as modern of their time, while in the process, in numerous writings and with endless repetition, they heaped scorn on the medieval art and architecture and philosophical thought. This attitude of men who were so convinced of their glory and superiority, well, guess what? It influenced later writers who admired it. According to Professor Douglas Bush, the anti-prejudices of 16th century Protestants and 18th century Enlightenment writers also contributed heavily to anti-medievalism. The leading one in that period was the anti-Catholic Voltaire. He thought that real philosophy did not blossom until the end of the very bright 16th century. Professor Bush gives the most credit for shaping the anti-medieval lie, however, to the secular humanistic rationalism of the 19th century. This is what he says. From that point of view, the Middle Ages, for the point of view referring to the humanistic rationalism, from that point of view, the Middle Ages appeared as not much more than a long cultural lag, a period in which man was enslaved by a system based on religious superstition and unnatural restraint. This view is clearly on display in many, many books, but I'd like to mention three in particular. The works of Jules Michelet, Jacob Burckhardt, and John Addington Symonds. They probably stand out among many of them. Jules Michelet, who is he? He was a French liberal historian who exalted the Renaissance as a heroic period of rediscovery of man and the world after a deplorable, as he said, dark age. He offered an architectural analogy contrasting the Gothic style, this is what he said, which still supports the temple only with the aid of a cumbrous apparatus of props and buttresses, comparing that with the rational, mathematical, self-supporting art of the Renaissance. As for medieval science, Jules Michelet claimed that it exists only thanks to the Arabs and the Jews. The rest is worse than worthless and useless. He believed that both nature and science had fallen victim to medieval terrorism and repression. Michelet had a lot of followers, and one of them was Jacob Burckhardt, who wrote a book called The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. It was published in 1860. It's been translated and republished many, many times since. The Renaissance could not have had a more ardent, zealous champion than this man. He used phrases from Michelet's works, and this is what Burckhardt gushed. To the discovery of the outward world, the Renaissance added a still greater achievement by first discerning and bringing to light the full, whole nature of man. He characterized this as worldliness, which for him meant a quality of earnestness so modern that it can, never be dislodged. Then he goes on to say, the Middle Ages, which spared themselves the trouble of induction and free inquiry, can have no right to impose upon us their dogmatical verdict in matters of such vast importance. Talk about being dogmatic. He's dogmatic, huh? And then another writer, John Addington Symonds, a 19th century literary critic. He was very much enamored of the Renaissance, and this is how he characterized the Middle Ages. As a time when man had lived enveloped in a cowl referring to the hood over a monk, okay? He had not seen the beauty of the world, or had seen it only to cross himself and turn himself aside and tell his beads and pray. Then he goes on in that same passage to describe St. Bernard passing along the shore of Loch Lomond without noticing, he said, the loveliness of the surroundings, but merely, is how he says it, bending a thought-burdened forehead over the neck of his mule. Even like this monk, humanity had passed a careful pilgrim, intent on the terrors of sin, death, and judgment along the highways of the world, and had scarcely known that they were sight-worthy, or that a life is blessing. Ignorance Ignorance is acceptable to God as a proof of faith and submission. Abstinence and mortification are the only safe rules of life. These were the fixed ideas of the ascetic medieval church. Fortunately, in his view, these depressing rules of the medieval, this oppressiveness, this darkness, this awkwardness, this ignorance, it was destroyed by the beautiful period of the Renaissance. Here's how he says it. Rending the thick veil which they had drawn between the mind of man and outer world, and flashing the light of reality upon the darkened place of his own nature. The Renaissance was the liberation of the reason from a dungeon, the double discovery of the outer world and the inner world. Well, you can see where he stands, right? He's a person who is enamored, all in for the Renaissance. Now, fortunately, there was a tiny shift in attitudes. There was an alternative thing happening in the 19th century view of the medieval times. And it began to emerge in the early part of the century due to the work of scholars who collected and started studying actual texts, the medieval texts. These things were made from the perspective of their own worldview. Guys like Simmons and Burckhardt and the other ones, they were just looking from it. I've often called it Rorschach historicizing. You know what the Rorschach test is? They hold up an ink blot, and what do? What do you see there? They say, oh, I see butterflies and balloons. And let's say, well, this guy lives in a fantasy world, But a lot of times that's what people do with history or even theology. They project their own agenda on, they only search for the information they want, excluding or ignoring all the other information that may contradict anything that these people say. Well, there was a shift in it in the early part of the 19th century because scholars started gathering things and actually started to study the original text. The new information from these texts, well, they really suited the people of the Romantic period, that artistic and intellectual movement that reacted to what? To the time of the Enlightenment and to the classical artistic norms. In particular, the Romanticists, they disliked the denigration of the Middle Ages that was in vogue. But however, as much as they were trying to recover the Middle Ages, Norman Cantor, the Jewish medieval writer, in his book called Inventing the Middle Ages, he says this: the Romantics of the early 19th century replaced this negative view of the Middle Ages with the shining image of a Gothic culture steeped in idealism, spirituality, heroism, and adoration of women. But the Romantics lacked the scholarship, the learning, and the instruments of research to go beyond the most superficial kind of inquiry into the medieval past. In other words, they liked it because of certain things, but they really didn't understand it. Both the Renaissance denigration of the Middle Ages and the Romantic acclamation of medieval culture were almost exclusively based on mere ideological projects. The Romantics liked the Middle Ages because they thought they saw in that world the beliefs and behaviors that contrasted vividly with the rationalism, the cold rationalism of the Enlightenment, and the mechanism of the Industrial Revolution, and the centralizing bureaucracy of the national state, which they found repulsive and conducive to dehumanization. So they exalted it a little bit, but for the wrong reasons. In the second half, though, of the 19th century, other movements came along that really began to push the anti-medieval days. They were nationalism, determinism, social Darwinism. All these began to influence the Victorians, began to influence heavily. In the Victorian period, the Romanticists, they began to wane. The Jewish medieval writer, Cantor, he was moved to wonder why this era simply could not get the Middle Ages right. That's what he said. Did the 19th century historians misunderstand the Middle Ages because they were early pioneers who worked with a very narrow database? Or was there something about the Victorian mind, its love of huge entities, vulgarly simple models, hastily generalized and overdetermined evolutionary schemes that made it unsuitable for doing lasting work in understanding and interpreting the Middle Ages? We may say that both conditions were at work in fostering the Victorian Romantic misconstruction of the Middle Ages. In the early part of the 20th century, medieval studies began to become really popular with academia. And the research of medieval scholars, they began to turn up what? Documenting evidence that had been previously unknown or unutilized by many, many historians. And by the middle of the 20th century, a number of very first-rate works on various aspects of medieval thought and society has started to come available. Here's the problem, though. The writers of popular history had not yet gotten the word that there were some really good things found in the Middle Ages. And even though there was excellent academic work in the history, about medieval history, it was being done in the 20th century, resulted in many scholarly works that were available to anyone who wanted to pursue it. People went with the popular versions. You know, when you have to do a little rigorous studies, people kind of want to go with the Reader's Digest version of something. You know, it's not easy to read; it's really accessible. Now, these scholarly works, they range from studies of daily life in the Middle Ages to medieval science and technology to literature and art and philosophy. But as I said, these incredibly good researched works were largely ignored by the writers of popular books of history. Instead, popular 20th century books, what are they filled with? The rehashing of the same old tired lie and myth. For example, John Hale, he's the author of the 1965 Renaissance volume in the Time Life series. Remember that series, the Time Life series? You got a whole series on them. Well, he described the Renaissance mentality as contrasted with the medieval. This is what he said. Men and nature were treated not as generalizations of themselves, but as individual beings and things interesting for their own sake. What's the implication there? The implication would seem to be that the medieval people saw all things as just as abstraction and uninteresting abstraction at that. And 2 pages later, John Hale says, we're told that the Renaissance people wanted a more practical kind of education, the one provided by the theological studies of the Middle Ages, and that teachers turned their back on the medieval idealization of poverty, celibacy, and seclusion, instead praised family life and the wise use of riches. Now the teaching of the church was not necessarily a killjoy nature. Even a Catholic historian like Anne Fremantle, she displayed the same kind of anti-medieval mentality. Nearly 30 years after the appearance of the Time Life books that bashed the Middle Ages, we see another example of this in William Manchester's book called The World Lit Only by Fire, The Medieval Mind and Renaissance, a Portrait of an Age. Now, Manchester was a journalist. He wasn't a trained historian, even though he did write some historical biographies and some books on World War II. The problem is, while the scholars were complaining that all these popular works were just skewing the whole view of the Middle Ages, Manchester's book sold. And apparently his publisher didn't mind he was teaching falsehoods. What was Manchester's view of the Middle Ages? He had very few nuances. According to him, in medieval times, the strongest characteristic of the Catholic religion was complete resistance to change. Now, I'm going to come back to that, okay? But he believed the church resisted change and suppressed it. People not only did not know what time of day it was, they also had no sense of historical time. Medieval culture, what there was of it, could not compare with that of the classical ages or with culture today. As for the church, it was a disaster, riddled with corruption, superstition, and worldliness. Again, the difficulty in confronting the myth about the Dark Ages is that popular historical writers really have had much more influence than reputable disciplined scholars and researchers. The Dark Ages mentality, sadly, it still exists in modern academics, in our schools, from primary all the way up to the university college level. Now, the tide is beginning to turn among scholars, not so much among popular writers or the popular media, but among scholars. There was a real renaissance in the proper meaning of the word of interest in medieval studies in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. See, by then, scientific medieval history, with its emphasis on systematic collection and analysis of ancient documents and other historical data, what happened? It became a discipline. People really got knuckled down. They started really working at these things. Sadly, the development came too late to squash the Renaissance myth and the medieval myth. But it did give a solid foundation for the flourishing of medieval studies in most countries of the West. For example, I'm going to give you some names. English and American historians such as Charles Homer Haskins, Lynn Thorndike, Don David Knowles, Richard Southern, Christopher Dawson, Eleanor Shipley Duckett, Regine Pernone, and many others who are both Catholic and non-Catholic. What they're doing now is helping to demolish this myth that the Middle Ages was just one long, dark, forsaken period. One recent college book actually stated that there was no real rupture between the medieval days and the Renaissance period, and that there wasn't any real dark age at all. In fact, the Renaissance was not superior to that age that preceded it. In fact, it built upon it. Now, that's a breath of fresh air that we need to understand, but it's still rare to find in a lot of mainstream media and popular writing and even in schools. I say that because just a decade ago, one professor of Renaissance and early modern man actually dared someone, a man or woman, to really find a significant contribution that was made by the Middle Ages, such as, for example, individual human rights. Then it could prove to him that the Middle Ages was a great period. Otherwise, he could not find any good in the Middle Ages. Well, see, in his mind, individual human rights considered one of the great contributions, he believed, from the Enlightenment period of the 18th century. And he thought he was on very safe grounds in making that charge or that challenge. Well, what would happen? A few years later, the medieval writer Brian Tierney, The Idea of Natural Rights, what did he do? He traced the concept of human rights back to medieval philosophers, starting with whom our great St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, a good rousing start to the revision started with Homer Haskins' 1927 classic, The Renaissance of the 12th Century. Pay attention to that title, The Renaissance of the 12th Century. The first line of the preface, it really throws down the gauntlet to the bashers of medieval studies and medieval writers. Here's what he writes. The title of this book will appear to many to contain a flagrant contradiction. A Renaissance in the 12th century. Do not the Middle Ages, that epoch of ignorance, stagnation, and gloom, stand in the sharpest contrast to the light and the progress and freedom of the Italian Renaissance which followed? How could there be a Renaissance in the Middle Ages when men had no eye for the joy and the beauty and the knowledge of this passing world? Their gaze was ever fixed on the terrors of the world to come. In truth, and he continues, the Middle Ages, Cantor says, in truth, exhibit life and color and change, much eager search after knowledge and beauty, much creative accomplishment in art and literature and institutions. However, this conception runs counter to ideas widely prevalent, not only among the unlearned, but among many who ought to know better. To these, the Middle Ages are synonymous with all that is static, uniform, and unprogressive. Medieval is applied to anything outgrown. The barbarism of the Goths and the Vandals is thus spread out over the following centuries, even to the Gothic architecture, which was one of the crowning achievements of the construction genius of the race. On the other hand, he adds, those who speak of the Enlightenment and Renaissance must ignore the Renaissance preoccupation with such unenlightened pursuits as alchemy and demonology. That was part of the Renaissance, you know. People kind of pick and choose what they want. Well, Haskell's work demonstrated the 12th century's tremendous interest in learning and education and its revival of the intensive study of the Latin language and classical literature. See, these studies had declined following the early cultivation of them during Charlemagne. With the collapse of the Roman Empire, things declined. Science, philosophy, jurisprudence, law, and historical writing all underwent revivals in the 12th century, along with masterpieces in the artistic area. So in summary, the claim that the Middle Ages were one long dark age of ignorance and superstition, relieved only by the advent of the Renaissance and later by the succeeding movements of the Enlightenment, rationalism, and modernism, it's just that. It's a claim, and it's a false one. It was developed by the Renaissance authors and the people of the Renaissance, and people who loved that period, by the Enlightenment philosophers, by popular writers, and by anyone who disliked or still dislikes, on principle, any period influenced by Christianity. In other words, most of it came out of and still propagated by uninformed and oftentimes anti-Catholic mentality. The truth is, brothers and sisters, and we're going to see it in just a moment reconfirmed in this short video, the Middle Ages was an extraordinary period of time which created a launching pad for so much in later ages. I'll be discussing some of these contributions and other myths up the road. But let me give you a brief list of some of the great contributions in the Middle Ages. See, with the beginning of the Dark Ages, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, there came a chaotic period of massive foreign invasion and breakdown in every area of life and culture. During this time of great upheaval, civilization survived almost exclusively in one institution, the church, the Catholic Church. It was the monks in the monasteries that preserved almost all that we know from the previous centuries. How? Copying by hand those great manuscripts to preserve learning. The Catholic Church developed a school system from grade school to the university to educate both men and women, young to older. And, brothers and sisters, the Catholic Church was the protector in the Middle Ages of academic freedom and not the enemy of academic freedom, as so many people falsely claim. The medieval university begged for a papal charter. Why? Because it guaranteed them academic freedom that was often oppressed by the local kings and local authorities and institutions where they were founded. You know, one is tempted here to compare the Catholic attitude towards study and scholarship with the Reformation attacks on scholars, so the Protestant attacks on scholars such as Copernicus and Kepler, both of whom were protected and encouraged by the Catholic Church. Examples of groundbreaking medieval scholarship, brothers and sisters, would fill volumes. In philosophy alone, the work of Duns Scotus, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Bonaventure, Abelard, St. Albert the Great. It's staggering. In science, it was against Albertus Magnus, St. Albert the Great. He was the teacher of St. Thomas Aquinas. He was the first botanist since the classical times. He literally had, in his time, huge laboratories with all these specimens from everywhere you could gather them. He was way ahead of our time. It was the Franciscan, Roger Bacon, who first developed the science of optics, mapping parts of the eye with extraordinary accuracy. By the way, a practical application of that new study in optics was what? The invention of the eyeglasses. We're not certain about who invented it, but I'll tell you what, the medieval scholarly communities really appreciated it as their eyesight dimmed. As for theoretical science, late medieval scientists in England began to explore the mathematical physics on which Isaac Newton would later build. Writing in Homiletic and Pastoral Review, Father Joseph de la Torre, a specialist in Thomistic theology and philosophy, he traces the origin of the great scientific breakthroughs of the 16th and 17th century. He demonstrates that they were actually, in fact, the consequences of the epistemological realism of 13th century philosophers, with St. Thomas at the head. Here's what he writes. He says, the Thomistic method was the real cause of the scientific breakthrough, not the method advocated by Francis Bacon or that of René Descartes. They were both in the 17th century. Descartes reduced it to simple mathematical deductions, mistrusting observation experiment, and Bacon reduced it to pure observation experiment, excluding mathematics. The real creators of the scientific breakthrough, such as Leonardo da Vinci, Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and of course Newton, they followed the golden rules formulated by whom? St. Thomas Aquinas. Medieval scholars produced masterful works on theology, political science, law, teaching techniques, and much more. And why was that? Because they were willing to explore every aspect of reality because of their commitment to what? To rational analysis and their confidence in human reason. For them, the intellect was the highest faculty of the soul, and the truths of discern, they believed, couldn't possibly contradict the truths of faith because God is the author of both of them. You know, we often say if a religion is contradictory to good reason, good human reason, it's bad religion. It's a good rule of thumb. If your religion tells you to cut off someone's head, it's bad religion. It's counter to human reason, huh? That's what the church has always taught. The whole sprawling, inquiring, intellectual movement, one of the major developments in Westernization, civilization, originated, fostered, encouraged, and protected by the Catholic Church starting in the Middle Ages. Get this, medieval thinkers were also concerned about economics, and developed moral principles. Like the whole question of usury, charging interest, huh? It demonstrates the constant concern of medieval thinkers about justice and charity when it came to the economy, as well as other spheres of life. It thus reflects that the concern of the church was promoting economic prosperity and progress. This concern was reflected with great clarity in the medieval guilds. You know what the guilds were? They were groups of people in towns, the master builders, the stoneworkers, the carpenters, the shoemakers. And you worked your way up through the guild. You'd find a master. You'd start off as an apprentice and you would learn. Then you become a journeyman, and literally, what did you do as a journeyman? You literally would journey all the way around to distant cities and hook up with other masters and learn as many techniques, and you come back and you take your test to become a master, and then you would get an apprentice. But these guilds, not only did they develop skilled workers, but they also paved the way for the development of capitalism, and for workers' rights, and for the care of the worker if he was injured. When you go back to the medieval days, the social service provided by guilds for their workers, part of their guild, utterly impressive. And just as notable, the first, as I mentioned before, architectural style in over 700 years was developed in the Middle Ages, the great Gothic cathedrals. They had walls that soared in the sky, numerous windows to let in incredible light. Have anybody been to Notre Dame, for example, in Paris? Or even more impressive, if you get to Notre Dame, you go out the front doors, go that direction 2 blocks, and you hit Sainte-Chapelle. It's breathtaking. Breathtaking. It was built by King Louis IX to hold the relics that he had gathered from the East, particularly the crown of thorns. It is always brought out on Good Friday and marched from Sainte-Chapelle to Notre Dame and back. But this beautiful thing is, when you walk upstairs in it, it's like being in a giant jewel box. You're surrounded by stained glass windows. You don't know how they stand there, but they're held by these thin, beautiful buttresses that it's breathtaking, breathtaking. All came out of that. They went down as deep as a subway station, as hundreds of feet in the air, supported by the flying buttresses. G.K. Chesterton summed it up well when he called the medieval civilization a great growth of new things produced by a living thing, contrasted with the Renaissance as a resurrection of old things discovered in a dead thing, the ancient world. He went so far as to call Renaissance architecture the relapse, since it was not a new creation like the Gothic, but just a harking back to the domes of Rome. In other words, it's a myth. The medieval times, an incredibly creative time. What I'd like to do right now is just show you a brief video, and then we'll take a little break if you want to come back and ask questions. This is from Prager University. We're trying to get Dennis Prager to come here and talk, but if you ever get a chance, go to Dennis Prager, go to Prager University. 5-minute videos on many areas, but this is very, very well done, and it's just a simple little presentation.
No period of history is more misunderstood or underappreciated than the Middle Ages. 10 centuries from the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century to the start of the Renaissance in the 15th. This is especially true between the year 1000, when global warming brought grapes to England and grain to the coast of Greenland, doubling the population and reviving town life all across Europe, and 1348, after the warming had ended and the blackjack arrived from the east. Let's take a closer look at these years. We'll make a good start by dispelling some nonsense. The people of the Middle Ages did not believe the earth was flat. They knew it was round. The ancients said it was round. The fathers of the church said it was round. They saw its shadow during an eclipse of the moon and the shadow was round, they saw masses of ships sinking below the horizon, round. More nonsense. The Middle Ages were cheerless. Like the verse, they were full of color, of celebrations involving everybody in town. They invented the carnival. They revived popular drama which had lain dormant for 1,000 years. Whatever they did, whether it was sinning or fighting or repenting or falling in love or traveling thousands of miles to Rome or to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, they did it with energy and gusto. What do we owe to the Middle Ages? How about the university? Medieval man invented it. For the first time in the history of the world, you could go to Paris or Bologna or Padua or Oxford or Prague or Cologne and study under masters of law, medicine, philosophy, and theology, and your degree, designating you as a master or a doctor, would hold good anywhere in Europe. It was an international community of scholars. A young Thomas Aquinas, born in southern Italy at the beginning of the 13th century, would travel to Cologne to study philosophy under the philosopher-biologist Albert the Great, then to Paris, where he taught theology and philosophy, then to Rome, and back to France. And this sort of thing was the rule among scholars, not the exception. How about modern science? Thomas's teacher, Albert, was a biologist. Why should that surprise us? Medieval man believed that God made the world as an ordered whole. They learned it both from scripture and from pagan thinkers, such as Aristotle. Science did not burst on the scene with Galileo. Copernicus died in the 16th century, but he was a priest astronomer at a Polish university founded in the Middle Ages. He wasn't even the first man to suggest that the Earth orbited the Sun. Others had ventured this suggestion. Most prominent was the late medieval Nicholas of Cusa, a philosopher and a cardinal in the church. How about architecture? If the Middle Ages were dark and ignorant, how come ordinary people, masons, carpenters, painters, sculptors, glaziers, erected the most beautiful and majestic buildings to grace the earth, the Gothic cathedrals, without power tools, with pulleys and winches and scaffolding in their bare hands, they built up lacework in stone and glass, flooding vast interior spaces with color and light. We have nothing to match their complexity and beauty. And art? Studying the ancients, medieval man produced whole genres of art that the world had never seen. There had never been anything like Dante's Divine Comedy, or Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, or the Arthurian legends of Cretin de Troyes, or the paintings of Giotto, or the astonishingly beautiful and precise work of the illuminators of manuscripts. What else do we owe to them? Western music. They invented our musical notation and Western harmony, not to mention the humble carols we enjoy at Christmas time. A tradition of local self-government. Witness the chartered towns all over Europe, free associations of men united for the common good, friars, guildsmen, members of lay orders devoted to good works, people who established schools, orphanages, and hospitals. Far from the Dark Ages, which it is popularly called, the Middle Ages might better be described as the brilliant ages. A startling epoch of progress from science to art, from philosophy to medicine. Indeed, in one crucial way, we are less civilized than those who enhanced human existence over 1,000 years ago. We dismiss the achievements of our ancestors and fall short of them. They honored their ancestors and surpassed them. I'm Anthony Esselin of Providence College for Prager University.
Join Prager University. Click here to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click here to sign up for...
I want to thank you for coming. It's always a joy. It always forces me to go through things. So we'll continue with other myths of the church. Things like the Inquisition we're going to cover. Things like Pope Pius XII. Did he do anything to counteract the horrors of Nazism, all those kinds of questions that raise that people want to discredit the church so they could discredit our truth. Have a blessed night.